Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Rose City Politics. It is November the 24th. Our regular panel tonight includes Doug Sartori, Don Merrifield Jr., and myself, John Lidke. We also have a guest panelist tonight, Melinda Munro, local municipal consultant and integrity commissioner. Melinda, how are you doing?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
Really good. We're glad to have you on. We've got a topic that we want to talk to you specifically about tonight with municipal codes of conduct and reformation of them if it's necessary. So we'll put a pin in that. But we also have Doug. Doug, you're coming to us from an office. There's no special background.
I know I've been depressingly mundane these last couple of weeks. I hope that the audience will stick with us despite me living in the real world.
You should have just really committed and said that that was the virtual background.
Oh, next time. Ask me again next week, John.
I'll check in a bit. And we have Don. Don, how are you doing? In the void.
I'm very good. Still my white void of emptiness, but it's where I'm comfortable, John.
That's good. As long as you're comfortable. Soon we're gonna get you out of the void. I promise. We're almost out of COVID. If you're listening right now and you are not a Patreon subscriber, we would really appreciate it if you would become one. Head to patreon.com/Rose City Politics. We are in BizX Magazine and bizxmagazine.com and on all of your favorite social media and podcasting apps. And Rose City Politics has been able to broadcast live on tape thanks to the kind support of Liuna 625 Building Better Communities. Now, we've got a really fun show tonight. We've got a bunch of topics we're going to try to get to, and we'll see if we do. Odds are we won't, so I'm going to try to be really quick about this here. First, we're going to be talking about Ontario municipal codes of conduct. We're going to move on to talking about Mayor Dilkens and what he wants to see for the budget, a tax hike of under 2%. Then we've got a Developer Don segment. Haven't had one of those in a while. We're going to be talking about lakeshore and development, and we'll leave it right there and we'll see what we can get to. But let's jump right into it. And I'm going to do a little handoff right here to Doug Sartori. And Doug, you're going to be doing some of the rarely seen hosting duties right here.
Scary stuff. I'll see what I can do. So yeah, there was a TVO piece put out yesterday. Cameron Crutch, Justin Towndale, and Douglas Judson were the subject of it. And they basically are advocating that the current code of conduct regime is a political tool that is weaponized to chill progressive speech, retaliate against criticism, and judicialize the democratic process. We have a couple of notable local integrity commissioner complaints here in Windsor, Essex that I think can perhaps point to supporting that argument. The dueling IC complaints in Essex, first against Councillor Chris Vanderdolen, then against Councillor Sherry Bondi. We've also had a few questionable integrity commissioner complaints happening in Windsor from complaints that were perhaps made somewhat frivolously and dismissed around elected officials, but also more serious ones that went all the way to to council sitting in judgment. Reno Bordeland's 2018 integrity commissioner complaint relating to his comments about safety in Windsor alleys is the one that I'm thinking of. I'm sure that we'll come up with other examples as we move along. Yeah, so the topic is the politicization of the integrity commissioner complaint process and whether code of conduct complaints are something that should be reformed. What do you think, Melinda?
Oh, that's a question to me. Sorry, I thought we were all right. What do I think? It's an interesting question, and it's coming up quite. This isn't the first time that we've heard about the weaponization of integrity commissioner complaints, and it isn't. I sat on a panel recently. I guess it would have been about a month or so ago. It was proposed. It was run through York University, and they actually titled the panel "Hired Guns: Integrity Commissioners, Hired Guns or Beacons of Hope." And so it was a bit irritating. Like, well, hired guns, that's, it seems a bit extreme. So I think the What's been interesting lately around the discussion around integrity commissioners is trying to balance this conversation about free speech. So to what extent are integrity commissioners meant to be Hermione Granger, and to use a kind of Harry Potter example, where we've got our little prefect badge on and we're running around the place and we're telling people how to behave all the time. And we're super good, and we never and everyone is required to be back in their dorm room on time. Or to what extent are we meant to be a kind of a Dumbledore type character? We're just telling people, look, try and be better, and we're guiding people to be better. And to what extent, and some integrity commissioners fall on this end of the spectrum, are we saying political speech is wide open? So the TVO article was interesting in that they were talking about how political speech appears to be being squelched. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have some decisions that were made not that long ago up in Peterborough, where the integrity commissioner said, it's perfectly fine to say whatever you want about other political actors if you're politicians, just learn to live with it. And so there's this interesting conversation going on about what does that code of conduct mean? If it's politician versus politician, free speech applies. If it's politicians saying mean things about the public, maybe not so much, or about a particular member of the public. And if it's a politician saying a mean thing or behaving badly around a staff person, not allowed, because there's no remedy for them except to go through the integrity commissioner's office. I'm not sure that we've settled yet on where that lands. So the TDO example gave some interesting cases. That there was an integrity commissioner who was not a lawyer in the Judson situation. So for anyone who isn't familiar with that case, Douglas Judson is a counselor up north, and they were debating whether to change the name of Colonization Road to something less racist. And there were a lot of complaints from the community. And Douglas Judson put on his, I think it was maybe his Twitter account, a coffee mug. It said white senior citizen on it. And some anonymous person said, calling someone a white senior citizen is racist. That integrity commissioner, who was not a lawyer, agreed with that and said that that was a racist thing. He shouldn't say it. And he proposed to be disciplined, and the council said, we're not disciplining you for that. So the council exercises its authority to get rid of that. Is that squelching of free speech, or is that an integrity commissioner who's not very good at their job? And to what extent? And it's really a balance. The code of conduct says you must behave respectfully. Where does free speech and political speech fall on the spectrum of behaving respectfully? So there's what I think about.
Okay, I want to bring in some other voices here, but I want to ask a follow-up question first, Melinda, and that is, if you don't mind getting into specifics, if I remember correctly, there was an awful lot of conversation about the code of conduct in Windsor that essentially requires councillors to uphold the decisions of council, and what that means and what it means for their ability to act politically. Is that a normal thing to see in codes of conduct municipally? And is the interpretation that's been made in Windsor something that we typically see elsewhere in Ontario?
No, so that has come up in some other communities where they have said that you have to respect the democratic process, so that the council is required to say council voted on this and that's their decision, and I respect that that's their decision, that I'm not going to somehow become rogue and act in a way that's not respectful of council's decision. But that doesn't mean that they can't say, I disagree with what happened. I wish it had gone differently. And I think that what happened in Windsor was bordering on the edge of saying, you have to be in lockstep. Once the council's decided their position, you can no longer, criticize it. And I think that notwithstanding that hasn't gone on to any further judicial review, the other communities have recognized that you can actually say that a council has made a decision that you don't agree with and why you don't agree with it. So that's an unusual thing. What's interesting about the Windsor one, so the Windsor one, basically, the Windsor Code of Conduct imported, sorry if I'm being a bit too pedantic, imported the procedure bylaw into the Code of Conduct. And it's the procedure bylaw that says you have to agree with the decisions of the council has made. And that's completely appropriate. It's violations of the procedure bylaw become a violation of the Code of Conduct. And that's what happened here. what's interesting that was going on in other parts of the province is this conversation about who enforces the procedure bylaw. Is it the integrity commissioner or is it the chair of the meeting? So if I'm in it, so there's recent situations taking place, and one is happening up in Whitby where a council member on a hot mic said something unkind about another councillor. And the question is it the integrity commissioner's job to enforce the procedure bylaw and say, you can't do that stuff in this meeting? Or is it the job of the chair of the meeting to say, no, I have the responsibility to enforce the respectful behavior rules in the actual meeting? And we're still waiting to have some decisions about how that works out. So I think so there's this, whose job it is to run the meeting respectfully. Is it the integrity commissioner? Is it Hermione Granger standing there like the hall monitor stepping in? Or is it the chair of the meeting who says, hold the phone, come on, people, we're going to behave properly?
Well, if I can jump in, then, I mean, what is the role of the integrity commissioner? Is it a reactive role or is it a proactive role? I mean, you're really catching me off guard here when you're saying, is it their job to say something in the meeting? And I'm just trying to remember, do we ever really have an integrity commissioner at our council meetings? They're there if they have to deal with a specific item, but it's not like they're part of administration, are they?
No, and they don't. But it's an interesting question. So are they proactive or reactive? They're reactive to complaints, so they don't make complaints. However, they are meant. So the whole history of integrity commissioners is like 20 years old at this point. And it comes from Justice Bellamy saying, we need these people called integrity commissioners to help educate our counselors and teach them how to be better so that complaints don't happen. So we have a proactive job of trying to say to counselors, don't be a jerk, don't say things that are stupid, don't beat up the staff, don't steal the money, so that they never have to make any complaints. So there are never complaints that get made. And that's the proactive part. And you don't see that happening. It's not obvious. In communities where there's few complaints, that's happening because integrity commissioners are working well to be proactive. But if there's a complaint, that's strictly a reactive situation. But I think there are people in the public who want it. They want Hermione to sit there and put her hand up and say, stop doing that. And they want the chairs of the meetings. I will say personally, as somebody who watches council meetings from time to time, I yell at the screen going, point of order, point of order. But the councillors very rarely raise the points of order. They allow themselves to be spoken to unkindly by each other. And I can't even remember a time when the chair was asked to rule on a point of order about respectful behavior in the council meeting.
Okay, John.
Well, I was just going to
ahead,
add, if integrity commissioners are going to get, stealing money out of the public world and not being able to say mean things about it, first of all, City of Windsor Council would have to be disbanded and we wouldn't have a show. So
I don't think any Windsor councils are stealing money.
No, I could bring up a councillor out me, and you had a great time stealing money.
And he did get an integrity commissioner complaint.
And he was kind of a jerk, actually.
And he was disciplined for it. Yes.
So he was a 2-for-1. He's a double threat, as we call in the business.
And that was a perfect opportunity for both the integrity commissioner and the auditor general to do their jobs.
100%. And actually, as probably the oldest person consistently on Rose City politics, I do think being called a senior citizen is racist. So in the future, if anyone calls me that, you will be getting a complaint.
There is no Rose City Politics Integrity Commissioner yet. Maybe we'll appoint one. John, I wanted to just ask you to chime in specifically about your experiences here. So you filed your share of Integrity Commissioner complaints. Am I remembering correctly? Did you file a complaint because Borelli blocked you on social media?
I filed it against Dilkins specifically. Yeah. And that was an interesting one. I mean, it didn't really end with an outcome whatsoever. There was no recommendation. It was a sort of wishy-washy ending from the integrity commissioner. But it did result in the mayor changing his practices, the entire process of it going to the media. And he stopped blocking people on social media for, I guess, maybe getting under his skin or their political opinions, and then moved to a very strict policy where it was simply for harassment. And that was the biggest point that I was trying to make, was that, I was never harassing the mayor. I was never demeaning the mayor. Certainly had issues. I see you, Don. I see you giving the wishy-washy hand symbol. But, we know at the time that Mayor Dilkins he didn't like that type of criticism that was coming out. And he specifically referred to my complaint at the time to local media as saying, well, this is just election time, and you're clearly seeing people trying to get out into the politics and try to do their electioneering. And I just went, you think what, I'm running for mayor here? Or you think that this is actually going to be some kind of a chink in your armor? It's like, this is just about people being able to access information. So it was disappointing that the IC, didn't make a recommendation on it. And that was at a time, Doug, there was a flurry of IC complaints as well from the community, some more meaningful than others.
So just remind me, John, so the IC didn't make it, so the IC didn't recommend any discipline, or the IC didn't recommend anything like there was like that, because typically what happens is the integrity commissioner issues a report and they say, I dismiss this complaint, and I might say there's some things you could do to be better, but this is not a complaint for which the discipline is warranted, or I accept the complaint and I'm recommending discipline of this kind. And so what happened? There was neither of those two things happened?
I would imagine that it was just dismissed. I'd have to go through my files for it, but I know that there wasn't a specific outcome that was levied where he, recommended that councillors act upon. Right.
So ordinarily, so the municipal act only really gives you a few things you can do as an integrity commissioner. So you can recommend a reprimand, and you can recommend suspension of pay. Some codes of conduct expand that. You can make some other kinds of remedial things, like people get training. And what we're seeing, what's interesting that we're seeing, and I think it was in that TVO article, is some councillors kind of going a bit off piste, or integrity commissioners going a bit off piste about that, and recommending things like in Calvin, which is a tiny municipality in Ontario, the integrity commissioner recommended that 2 councillors resign. That's way outside our remit. And those councillors did resign, and now there are by-elections in an election year and it's way outside what an integrity commissioner is allowed to do. So that was a bit strange. Or they recommend, there's compelled speech issues where in a couple of cases they said, I'm recommending that council require John Lidkey to say the following words. And that's being challenged as, compelled speech is not something that's in the remit of the integrity commissioner. So, but ordinarily we just say, there's no complaint, or you get a 2-day suspension of pay or a 90-day suspension of pay, or you need to apologize in your own words for this behavior that you did. So so what, obviously in those cases, the integrity commissioner said, well, I'm not going to recommend any kind of discipline.
The IC, he dropped it, and the justification for dropping it was that the mayor contacted his office and said that he had specifically unblocked me. And so the integrity commissioner said, well, then the matter is closed because there isn't a matter. And so he made no finding in the case.
So, and I don't want to take up the entire oxygen of this podcast, but one of the things that's happened as a consequence of complaints like that is that Toronto started, and then many of us have followed in their footsteps, to issue guidance to councils about social media behavior. So that, you shouldn't block people, your social media should follow certain guidelines, you need to separate your election social media from your council social media. So as a consequence of complaints like yours, we do see the evolution of ethical behavior. So notwithstanding that you may not have felt that your situation was resolved well, I think what we have seen is an improvement in the quality of social media behavior by councillors across the province.
So where do you land on this, Melinda? I think that there's always an appetite for people to have their conflicts adjudicated. Obviously people see themselves winning when those conflicts are adjudicated, but there's like a desire to have a referee to come out and say, 2 minutes in the penalty box for blocking John Lidkey on Twitter or whatever it is. So I think there's an appetite where people want that in a genuine way. And I take John at his word that he wanted to see change, that he thought that there was something that was happening that was unethical, and he was able to use the process to actually effect a change in practice. But then the other side of it is that you know, I think it's hard to argue that people don't deploy integrity commissioner complaints against their political enemies. You know, the case in Hamilton, and I think it's Cameron Croach there, the case where, you know, he made comments on social media, and based on that, you know, there was a complaint because he was serving on a city committee. And that one really smelled political to me. You know, I obviously don't know a lot about it. It's not our city, but I guess my question to you after all that preamble is, where do you land? You know, and do you think that the specifically like narrowing in on complaints, integrity commissioner code of conduct complaints, is this something that is a valuable new tool in the political toolbox in municipalities, or do you think that overall it is something else besides a valuable tool?
I think it's a valuable tool. I think it was a missing link, a missing element at the municipal level of government. So we talk about, particularly this podcast talks about how important the municipal level is, because it's directly involved in people's lives and make decisions that have immediate impact. We're going to talk about the budget later, have immediate impact on people's daily lives in a way that the federal government or the provincial government often don't. And they have these ethics regimes that municipalities never had. So I think it was a useful thing, and I think it has improved overall the quality of ethical behavior at the municipal level. What's interesting is that it came out of really bad behavior about money, because the Bellamy Commission was about MFP, and of course Windsor was involved in MFP too, so that was the leasing scandal. And then the most recent recommendations came out of the Collingwood inquiry, and that was about money, and it was about a CAO and a mayor conspiring to sell a utility and waste the money on buying a new arena, and it was a very messy situation. A regime that was designed to deal with money issues has morphed into a regime that's designed to deal with harassment and ethical and respectful behavior, and it's not it's not quite well enough designed for that. I will take issue with most people want a referee. I think it takes a lot of, so there's certain people for whom filing an integrity commissioner complaint is like falling off a log. But the serious complaints that I've had to deal with, and the serious complaints I've seen, it's taken somebody really a lot of time to screw up their courage to actually go down that road. It's not an easy road to go down, because you're going to be cross-examined by an integrity commissioner, maybe even under oath. It's not that comfortable. That if the counselor winds up hiring legal counsel, it's even less comfortable. And so it's a difficult process. Most integrity commissioners, including me, start that process. First day, complaint comes in, and we say, how can we resolve this without going any further? So, Mr. Lidke, what would you need from the mayor in order to withdraw your complaint? What would satisfy you? And if the mayor had said, you know what, John, I'm going to unblock you, and I'm going to adopt the practice of not blocking people who criticize me, I'll find another way, you would have withdrawn the complaint, it would have gone away.
Absolutely.
So most people, that's what they want. They just want the person to be better. And the integrity commissioner starts from the perspective of, how can I help this counselor be better? And if they can't, then you wind up down these ugly, many hundreds of $1,000s roads later. But that's not where most integrity commissioners want to start. And it's not where most complainants want to start. They've at their wits' end. The problem is when it does get weaponized, and Doug, you've pointed that out, there's two sides of that. Side one is filing the complaint can be enough, especially if you file it with a big press release, is enough to create the harm. And now the counselors are humiliated in public. They're angry. That deal is not going to happen. And you have counselors who feed off of that. They embrace being complained. The more complaints, the better. It's their brand. And so as an integrity commissioner, you're kind of in between those two things, trying to say, how the harm's been done, but how can I fix it? Can I figure out a way to bring everybody back to the goal, which is be better? With a counselor who is saying, bring it. I won't complain. The more complaints, the better. That is a tough one to deal with as an integrity commissioner. You just have to put your head down, do your investigation, issue a report. Maybe they care about the discipline, maybe they don't. And you leave it and you say, ultimately, the most important integrity commissioner we have is the voter in the ballot box. In the voting booth. They're the real integrity commissioner.
Okay, well, last thing on this topic, in the piece, there are some what are called common sense legislative amendments proposed. I'll just list them quickly. A standardized code of conduct, a centralized commissioner adjudicator, codified expectations of procedural fairness, and clarity that political expression is not sanctionable unless it rises to the level of hate speech under the criminal code or harassment under the human rights code. What do you think about those changes? Do you think that they would improve the code of conduct complaint process, or would they water it down, or something else?
No, I don't think they would water it down. I think having, you know, this is where I'm going to side with Dawn. I'm always a bit loath to increase the amount of bureaucracy attached to things. So a centralized, provincially run integrity commissioner regime might actually want to be more time consuming, more expensive, slower than each municipality being able to choose who they want. However, sometimes they choose people that, you know, support them and aren't very independent.
But what if you were the central integrity commissioner?
Oh, hey, perhaps. There's a lot more competent integrity commissioners than me. I think having minimum standards for the quality of integrity commissioners, I think would help. I don't think they have to be lawyers, but I think they have. One of the things that happened in the Judson situation was that the integrity commissioner used the definition of discrimination from Wikipedia. Well, discrimination is a term of art at law. Like, we've got plenty of case law, and we've got tons and tons of case law on what a fair investigation is. We don't need to codify that. We already know what it is. It's just the problem is if you're not trained as a lawyer or in that world, you don't know it. So if you want to be an integrity commissioner, you're not a lawyer, there's a course. We should have a course you can take. And then, you know, that enables people who've been clerks all of their careers, or municipal officials or not lawyers, could work in that world. I think those are things that would improve the regime without watering it down. But I don't think any of those recommendations specifically would water it down. I just worry that they might make it a bit more cumbersome and expensive.
I don't want to live in a world where Wikipedia is not a go-to resource for legal advice.
They could just arm wrestle it out. That would be my option if I was the integrity commissioner. How does I guess looking locally at the issues that have come up with Councillor Bordelon, and I believe John Elliott had a complaint from the public, an integrity commission complaint, when he told somebody to man up. And I forget what the substance of that conversation was, but I'm sure he felt real great telling everybody how tough he was. How do you guarantee, like, I guess in the Reno situation, or the Councillor Bordelon situation, we'll use as an example. He said something kind of flippant off the top of his head, maybe something maybe he shouldn't have said. I don't think anyone really cared except some of the politicians around the table, because the point he was making was actually a valid point, and maybe the way he described it, upset them. But they seem to use the integrity commissioner to kind of deflect from the real conversation, say, well, Reno said people were getting murdered in the streets. How does a city, especially when they're the ones hiring integrity commissioners, how do they guarantee the independence of these people? Because again, when the whole decision came down for Councillor Bordelon, to us, maybe not all, I guess I'm just speaking for myself, I guess, it really seemed like they kind of sided with the mayor, what he was saying. And it seemed like the mayor just made a phone call and, hey, help me out here. And that's kind of the feeling I got from the decision on that. How does a city guarantee that independence, that they're just going to make independent decisions?
Right. I certainly hope that wasn't the case. And Professor Ellman is, held in very high esteem, by the Law Society of Ontario. I think some of the ways that you do that, you choose people who are fundamentally independent. You choose people who, there are people who now make it their profession to be integrity commissioners, who are very, skilled at that work. And then so here's an example of someone who
just curious, like, where do I sign up for that course? Because I would love to get this gig.
The other thing is, choose somebody who's not from your community is probably a good idea too. But I'll just give you an example of a situation in an integrity commissioner who is very well known as a political operative, and that's Guy Jernam. And so Guy Journo was the chief of staff for Mike Harris, and I believe he worked in the office of Stephen Harper, and he might have even worked on Tim Hudak's political career at one point or another. So Guy has a number of clients. He's a lawyer now. He's always been a lawyer. He's got a number of municipalities he represents. In fact, Douglas Judson is the Madawaska Valley and those up north communities are part of his stable, if you will, of clients. So when Patrick Brown was elected as the mayor of Brampton, Guy Journo was their integrity commissioner, and he himself said, "I'm going to resign because no one will believe that I can fairly adjudicate any complaint against Patrick Brown." And so he stepped away. And I think that's the kind of person you want. Like, he's well known as a political operative, but he's chosen then to really transparently identify that and remove himself from situations where it could be questioned. Unfortunately, the integrity commissioner they have now has political connections to Patrick Brown, has not chosen to step away, and I think she's quite competent, but it certainly has raised questions in the community about whether she can independently evaluate the Brampton Council.
And for the guys on the show, Melinda brought up that little piece they were talking about. I would like to be considered the beacon of hope on Rose City politics. So if you guys could address me accordingly.
The hired gun. If you're the beacon of hope, who's the hired gun?
Well, that's John, obviously, because he has nothing but time to file complaints against people. And he gets blocked on Twitter, so he can't be a very nice guy.
Okay, calm down, Your Eminence, the beacon.
Anyway, just one more point about, because I think it's important about the independence. Have an independent, regular, competitive competition for who your integrity commissioner is going to be. So if Professor Elmont comes up again, run a full-on RFP, let the integrity commissioners around the province compete for that gig. And I think it's probably wise to choose someone who doesn't live in the community, frankly, because then you don't have any risk that people know anybody.
Are there any integrity commissioners in municipalities where it's actually a team of people as opposed to just one person, like, a group of panel of three or your Supreme Court of the world kind of thing?
The municipal act doesn't allow for that. It has to be one person. However, there's a number of law firms have so one person's named, but there's a whole lot of people that work on the complaints together. And then there's a firm called Principals Integrity. And it's a former clerk and a former lawyer working together, and they basically do all of their complaints together. But one person is the named integrity commission.
The beacon of hope.
Beacon of hope.
Want to move on?
Yeah, I'm
think
done
so.
making stupid
Yeah.
jokes, John. Go ahead.
Thanks for the permission, Beacon. Let's move on. Mayor Dilkens is calling for a tax hike of just under 2%. The proposed budget is going to council on Monday, December the 13th with deliberation, or excuse me, the proposed budget goes to council on Monday with December 13th set for deliberations. And Mayor Dilkens is calling for a property tax increase of just less than 2%, half the current rate of inflation, which is at 4.4%. That's brought up because inflationary pressures have caused city expenses to rise. According to the mayor, Windsor typically faces an annual inflation rate of between 1 and 1.2%. And as I said, again, it's at 4.4% right now. Also impacting this is that private companies that supply snow clearing and garbage to the city as a result of outsourcing in the past, contracts are based on the consumer price index, which weights heavily on fuel prices. All to say is that expenses keep going up. The mayor says that a zero tax increase would require cutting the roads and sewers budget, and that, he said, would have an impact on local jobs. Now, Mayor Dilkens said he expects that councillors will be demanding for increased spending for their own initiatives at budget time. But he said, quote, council is going to have to sacrifice for the betterment of all. So we've got some politicking here going on. This, I've been on the show now. This is my second year. So this is the second time that I've come across the mayor's posturing for budgets here. Doug, I want to go to you first on this one. It's not surprising to see this. I thought the bit of politics right there at the end, where Mayor Dilkens coming out pretty strong against his council colleagues, saying, I expect they're going to have their own priorities, but nope, sorry, we all just have to take the hit. What's your take on the whole read, or what's your read?
Well, this is the most important budget in the cycle because it's the last budget in the cycle. So this is what people will be remembering. This is the budget that will be on people's minds when they go to the ballot box next October. So I found it interesting that last year we landed with a tax freeze, and this year we did not, considering that timing. Mayor Dilkens has consistently wanted to land somewhere slightly under the rate of inflation with his increases. Where I think this is a problem is that we have ABC budgets that are not totally in council's control, particularly the police budget, and there's upward pressure there. And we now have an asset management plan that requires certain amount of spending by the municipality on the maintenance of its capital assets, and that itself represents over 1% of the overall increase. So if you set within those parameters, if you set those constraints ahead of time, to me that means that you're operating with very little room for error, very little room for change. And I haven't dove through the budget documents in detail yet. I've skimmed the documents, picked out some themes and whatnot. What strikes me is how difficult it is for our administration to continue to operate in an environment where there are no real increases year over year, despite costs increasing all around them. So that's got to make things really difficult. And on the operating side, and beyond that, I think one of the things to look at here is how user fees are rising. User fees are going up. I don't have examples in front of me, but take the example of needing a rat control done on your property. That used to be free. Now it's a fee to the user. I believe that the fees for recreation through Parks and Rec are all going up. So think about what that means. If we are maintaining as close as possible to an inflationary tax increase or a below inflationary tax increase, that amounts to a tax cut. So we are cutting taxes in real dollar terms. We are cutting taxes for property owners. And one of the ways that we're doing that is by raising the fees on people who use services. So what that means is that we're making the tax system less progressive in Windsor. We are trying to reduce the burden on property owners, which your taxes are in proportion to the value of your property. So in a sense, it's a wealth tax, and the wealthier you are in terms of at least your property wealth, the more tax you're going to pay to the city. But that is actually shrinking. That burden is shrinking, and what is rising is the cost of actually accessing city services. So if you're a person who would make a relatively modest contribution to the city's coffers through your taxes or through the taxes you pay to your landlord, whatever savings you might achieve are going to be totally blown away by increases to transit fees, increases to parks and recreation fees, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we're making life harder for the people who have it the hardest in Windsor, and making it easier for the people with the most wealth. And I'm not really sure that that's the direction that Windsorites want our city to go. I'm just not sure that that is a message that has been clearly articulated to folks. And the last thing that I'll say about this budget overall is that I'm not sure that it's so healthy and fruitful to start with the political target number rather than starting from what does this community need to do in this moment in time to thrive and develop. Start there and then make the politics work, rather than starting with the politics and then making the numbers work. To me, I would like to see more vision coming out of leadership than that.
Don, what's your take on?
Well,
Yeah.
fortunately for me, everything about my life, my assets, my income, and my house is in an LLP Panamanian corporation. So I don't really have to worry about paying taxes too much. So I have probably 2 points on this that are completely contradictory to each other. So that's Don in a nutshell. Ask any of my ex-wives. I understand what I don't understand with the whole topic of whether it's freezing taxes or blah, blah, we've been doing for years and years and years. And don't get me wrong, I don't want to pay any more taxes because I think they get wasted most of the time. So we'll start there. What I never understood is every year the tax base expands. I'm in real estate. Everybody here knows that. There's hundreds of houses and properties being built every year, which adds to the municipal assessment tax base. Even maintaining the current tax rate with an expanded tax assessment base should, in theory, increase revenue to the city. I think I kind of agree with that. This gets politicized a lot, and even a 1.89 we're doing this year, whatever the case may be. And inflation again is also a backwards looking thing, and I think inflation is going to ease over the next year, but that's a whole other topic. So even a 1.9% tax increase or whatever the number is going to be, if it's also inclusive of all the new properties that are brought online to the municipal assessment, actually increases revenue to the municipality more than the 1.9%, because for every house you add, basically, well, I'll use round numbers, you're adding about $6,000 in the tax base of the city. So that would offset some raises based off of using last year's total assessment value. So there is, if that's the way they're doing it, and I don't know it, I always thought that was the way they're doing it. Then when I found out that it was, we're holding the line on taxes, meaning we're staying at the same revenue amounts for the city. Well, that's stupid, because you can maintain the current tax rate and still increase revenues. So in essence, we've been actually decreasing our taxes for the last X number of years. I think Mayor Francis was the one who started it. Again, I'm more than happy to pay less taxes. So I would be more interested, as opposed to the percentage, in seeing the actual revenue that's going to be generated from the tax base. And that will show you what the real increase is to, available funds for the city to do whatever they got to do with.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Don, that there has been a revenue freeze. That for many years, the city does not take advantage of an increased tax base. It actually, the goal is to spend the same as last year. So, to your point, I think that only makes it worse as the city expands and we have more responsibilities, more miles of road to maintain, et cetera. We're doing it all on the same pot of revenue.
Well, and I agree with that. And I think it's going to sound like I'm making a joke, but how does this affect Don? But I think that's how everybody thinks when it comes to property taxes. If my taxes don't go up, I don't care. If somebody else's has to pay more, well, that's, their problem. But you could also, but like I said, you can do that and achieve more revenue just by the expansion of the tax base by property development. And they haven't been doing that. So I do agree with you. I think it's been foolhardy to go that route. I'm not going to lie. I sat here on this show for many years, and it was true at the time that our taxes, especially the commercial taxes, were way too high to encourage anyone to come here at the time based off of our property values. That needed to change, and it has changed. I mean, it's still not a perfect world. You always want lower taxes to get more investment, but it's a math problem. So now going the other way, now that he's saying we're going to raise taxes 1.89 or whatever the case may be, it actually is going to be a more than a 1.9% revenue increase for the city. Again, hopefully they're using the expanded tax base, not basing it off of last year's assessment.
Yeah, I know we want to go to Melinda, but they are continuing to use revenue as a measuring tool. So when we say a 1.9% increase, we're talking about a 1.9% increase in the spend, the amount of money that the city spends. But before we get
so that means to an individual taxpayer, your taxes may only go up 1.6% because the expanded tax base will take care of that extra revenue.
Well, I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure that that's the case. I'm sure Melinda will tell us, but I think what I wanted to get at, the point I wanted to make, is that this to me is looking through the wrong end of the telescope on policy. We are setting policy based on the headlines that it will generate. And the reason that I say that is what matters to people is their tax bill. But what matters to politicians is the coverage they get. And that media message of taxes are going up X percent. I don't remember reading about municipal affairs back in the 80s and 90s. I don't recall how the media framed it, but I bet that the Francis model of a quote unquote tax freeze is based on the way that tax increases were communicated through the media to the public, that the way that they cut through all the noise and complexity, and by they I mean local media, the way they cut through all the noise and complexity around tax rates versus property assessments versus et cetera, the size of the tax base, the way they cut through all that was by basically saying the city is spending 3% more, the city is spending 4% more, that's a 4% tax increase. That headline is what Mayor Francis was out to change, not necessarily any of the other consequences or benefits that happened. Melinda, what's your take?
Well, I got about a million things. And start with, it's interesting how the mayor positions himself as a finance minister. I'm surprised he doesn't show up at these press conferences with new shoes. Because he doesn't position the council as making the choices about the budget. He positions himself as the finance minister. And that's an interesting role to sort of put himself in. The second thing is he talks at some length in the article and about inflationary pressures are a problem. So who are inflationary pressures a problem for? Everyone. They're a problem for rich people, they're a problem for businesses, and they're a problem for poor people. So if a 4.4% inflation rate is a problem for poor people, and we're going to solve that problem by increasing user fees, then we've made that problem exponentially worse for poor people while making it better for rich people, people who can afford to own houses. And I think it talks as if, when the article talks as if inflation only affects property owners, but it actually affects people who are living from paycheck to paycheck just as badly. In fact, potentially worse. And if your transit pass is rising at a higher rate than the cost of inflation, then how fair is that? So that's the second thing. And then the third thing is, what's strategic about this approach, right? So to get to Don's point, that the big splash is that the operating budgets are seeing a zero revenue increase. Whether or not that translates into a tax increase, that's something else, but it's a zero revenue increase for the operating budget. So notwithstanding the assessment growth, our houses are worth more, and there are more of them. So we could increase the operating budgets by the amount of the assessment growth, but we're not. We're fixing the revenue for operating departments where it was last year. But we've made all these other strategic decisions. Windsor Works, the climate emergency, all of these other strategic decisions. So there's an old adage that goes like this: don't tell me what you care about. Show me your budget and I'll tell you what you care about. Where are the investments in this budget into climate change mitigation? Not just the more sewers and roads, but other things we need to do to mitigate, like get people on the bus and out of their cars. Where's the investment in that? It's strictly a user fee investment, not an operating investment. It's a capital investment. It's a user fee investment. It's not an operating budget investment. Where's the anti-racism, diversity, equity, inclusion investments in different hiring practices, in community engagement? Where are those investments? If the operating departments are making those investments, they are cutting something else because they have a zero revenue increase. So we've made all kinds of other strategic decisions, and every single year we abandon them as if they have no meaning, because the only strategic decision that matters in this community is zero tax increases.
Yeah,
Is it?
go ahead, John.
I mean, has it been good electoral politics, do you think? I mean, do you think that any of them can point to it and say specifically like, oh, I won because of that messaging specifically? Or do you think that they would have been able to get by on other things and we're just living the outcome of, some consistently bad policy decisions year after year after year? It feels like Groundhog's Day to anyone.
I haven't run as a municipal councillor, but John has, and I think of people like you were talking last week about Darcy Reno, who has decided if you're going to win in Ward 1, you got to talk about money, and so she's talking about money in ways that perhaps are making the current councillor a bit uncomfortable. It may be in some wards you win because you talk about money. There are other wards, and perhaps I'm getting too political, if as a consequence of this budget and a consequence of federal decisions, Addie Knox does not go forward in the way that was proposed at that big meeting, the Ward 2 councillor is going to have his feet in the fire when he's going door to door.
Yeah, no question. So I think it's like a really interesting and multi-layered question that John has asked. There is an appetite for zero or reduced taxes. And it's not, I would imagine it's not a small appetite. We've got Don on the show, who is the avatar of that mentality. And I mean,
my name's not Don. It's corporation number 065432 Panama Inc.
So that view exists in our community. I think that view is concentrated in some areas that are politically important because voter turnout is higher there. I'm thinking particularly of Ward 1, possibly Ward 6 as well. So there's a concentration of this kind of attitude in places where it matters. I also think that there is an element of beyond electoral politics in terms of just counting votes at the ballot box. There's also an element here of where your donors are on these issues. And if your donors, and I haven't looked through the donation list of any candidate from past elections through this lens specifically, but if your donors are property owners who have a significant holdings, then they are paying significant tax. And those tax rates and decisions around tax probably mean a lot to donors. And then I think you can see how it's not a pure slam dunk political winner in the way that it gets sold. I think it's probably true that there was a widespread sense in the community when all this started back in the earlier years of the Francis regime. I think there was a widespread sense in the community that there was too much fat at City Hall. And I think that sustained this narrative and this policy politically for a number of years, and possibly for the betterment of the community overall. For, maybe we can argue where you'd put that line, but for some number of years. One of the reasons that I call this a failed policy is that I evaluate it on its stated goals. And somewhere around 2008 or 2009, one of those stated goals became jobs and economic expansion. And I think, so the point that I'm getting at is that I think there's an appetite for a tax freeze for its own sake. But I think in order to build a bigger consensus and win elections on a policy like this, you need to paint a picture for the electorate about how it is going to benefit them beyond saving $3 or $8 or $20 a year on their taxes. And even as far in the past as 2008, 2009, when we were talking jobs, we need to freeze taxes because it's going to bring jobs to this city. That to me indicates that, Windsor is not a city of people who are driven to the, at the ballot box by fiscal pressure and thinking about fiscal matters and where are the tax rates. That's not top of everybody's minds. Or else you wouldn't have to dress it up in I'm going to be frank, in a bullshit argument about generating jobs in order to sell it to the electorate. So yeah, I think the politics of it are complicated, and now it's just traditional.
Let me just jump in and throw it back at you, because again, in this piece specifically, to talk about the jobs thing, Mayor Dilkin says that we couldn't have a zero tax increase this time because of the cuts that it would require to the roads and sewers budget, and how that would have an impact on local jobs. So
Yeah, but think about that one, right? Because that's a double message. When you say we would have to cut construction, we would have to cut public works, and that would eliminate jobs, that would reduce jobs. Okay, so there's the surface message, jobs are going to be a problem. Everybody likes jobs. You want your kid to have a job. You want your kid's useless husband to have a job, et cetera, et cetera. But then the second layer of that message is, well, what jobs are those? And who is generating a revenue and a profit from those jobs? And are those folks of particular interest to the mayor? And I would argue that they are.
Men.
That too.
Yeah. Well, I picked a bad time to turn my microphone on. So I'll answer a few of Melinda's questions. Talking about lower taxes and cost is not a winning strategy in Ward 3. I can promise you that. And if you remember, I'm looking at a July 20th article about the City of Windsor's anti-racism initiative, where it was funded with $200,000. So we've already solved racism apparently, because we've paid $200,000. So we don't have to worry about that problem anymore.
Yeah, but the vendor decided not to participate.
Well, he got the check. Why would you do that? So I'm going to give you, like, you kind of pointed at me as the poster child of the person who never wants to pay more taxes. And I'm going to explain myself on that. And I don't think the way I think about this is very uncommon, although I'm the only one dumb enough to come out in the public and say it loud. We sit here every week and we criticize and discuss decisions that the city makes. And a lot of times it is about economic things. We've talked about new city hall when that was being built. Should we do it or just refurb it? The list has gone on and on about, in our opinions, sometimes varied and sometimes different, the city has wasted tens of millions of dollars on X, Y, and Z that we don't agree with. We're not the be all and end all. Some people probably agree with these decisions. The Christmas lights are, the poster child for what we talk about every year. The way I feel, and the way I think a lot of people feel, is that if we saw a city that was run efficiently and didn't, and this may be, a little extra on the language, waste tens of millions of dollars every year on stupid things, I think people would be willing to pay more taxes. I'd be willing to pay more taxes if they went to things that I think are really important, like helping people who are homeless and getting them off the street, dealing with addictions, getting people housing. But if you're going to come to the population and voters on in the next year and say, okay, we have to raise your taxes X number of dollars, and then for the next 12 months we see, well, they're taking that money and they're building a dome over a stage downtown, or they're doing a $26 million deal with the University of Windsor, or they're paying $1 million to fix a streetcar, people are going to go, why am I paying more taxes if they're just doing stupid things with it and not solving or fixing or dealing with what I think most people think are real issues that Windsor has. So when you see people, when people see a lot of things in their mind going to waste, they don't want to pay more taxes. They don't care what the narrative is. And another point I guess I can make, I think it's foolhardy for whoever that comes out and says, we're going to want a 10% cut from each department, because it doesn't have to be that way. Some departments are more important than others, and you can be strategic about, we could cut, we could lose a tank down at the police services board and, save $1 million and put that towards X, Y, or Z. And, when they brought that tool out about letting the public say where they wanted to see their money done with those little graphs and sliders, and they could do that themselves with every department. Not every department is of equal importance, I guess is what I'm saying. So you can still achieve that. Again, I think the zero revenue thing is stupid, but you can achieve the 0% tax increase for the property taxpayers across the board, still raise revenue, but also, mess with the budgets on an individual basis of each of the departments to make the priorities, like Melinda said, don't tell me what your priorities are. We can show us what you're spending the money on, and we'll tell you what they are. And I think if people saw that more, they probably wouldn't be as opposed to paying more taxes.
So I'm going to push back a little bit just and to say, we actually have a spectacularly efficient and well-run municipal administration. It's stunningly efficient. And
Somebody turn off her mic.
Stunningly.
She's gone crazy.
what we have is a council who cannot give up their addiction to bright, shiny objects. And the fact that we have been able to support and fund those bright, shiny objects for the last 15 years and still deliver the level of services that we are delivering by those hardworking folks at City Hall, and welcome Mr. Raynard to that role. We have the most, I will say this as someone who works in this field, a breathtakingly competent and efficient municipal administration. And we have a council who is addicted to bright, shiny objects, who make their job harder every year.
And I agree with you. I don't think that there's a ton of waste down to the city from an operations standpoint. But I think, look, we sit here and talk about this stuff all the time. We're involved in politics. We pay attention. Most people don't. All they see is the budget is X number of dollars. They're not going through what they're spending it on. They don't care if it's capital or operations. We've had this discussion every show when we talk about the budget is, you can take some out of the capital budget and stick it in operations. That way those services don't get cut. There are solutions to these problems. So I don't want anyone to think that I think the city of Windsor's administration and the people who work there are just out wasting money. Sure, I can always find more things to outsource, but that's just me. I just think people see it as a whole. They don't look at it individually between the two sections. And when they see the city council addicted to bright, shiny objects, their response and my response is, screw you, I'm not giving you any more money. Don't ask for it. And I'm not saying screw you to you. I just mean metaphorically, screw them. The
metaphorically, metaphorically, screw you. I just have one more point I want to make on this, and because I think, Don, you brought something up that's worth exploring just a little bit. And the perception of waste. The perception of waste reduces your willingness to pay and your willingness to see increased taxes. And I think you're not alone in that. And I just wanted to connect that to something Melinda mentioned earlier in the show on a separate matter, and that's the Mfp scandal. Part of the genesis of this, because I think that it's also erodes people's trust and willingness to pay when they see scandals and corruption. When people see financial scandals and malfeasance and tax dollars being literally stolen, they lose their interest in paying. And Eddie Francis became mayor in part because of the Mfp scandal, in part because of the role he was seen to have played. And he leaned into that role. You can remember Graston drawing him in the Boy Scouts uniform, et cetera, et cetera. In a way, I think that you could see that Eddie Francis prefigured Stephen Harper in that sort of meticulous approach to ethical matters and matters of finances that for both of them, for both of those politicians, I think that they saw the perception of scandalous and particularly like financial scandals as something that would be politically fatal to them. And all of that, I think, feeds into this narrative and what we saw play out in over the 2000s and the 2010s in Windsor.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And one other thing, this may be a little bit off topic, but it's sort of on the same vein. Melinda had stated that inflationary pressures generally, they're going to hurt the lower income people. And everybody, it's a math problem, but obviously that's going to be the case. So if you're going to raise bus fares, they've talked about raising the bus fare going over to Detroit to $10. And so that is exponentially going to hit, lower income people. The interesting thing is going to be next year, going into 2023, because MPAC hasn't reassessed property values for, I think it'll be 6 years next year, and they are supposed to do them next year. The property value increases that we've all heard and talked about and seen in Windsor have been dramatic, but on a percentage basis, and that's what's going to affect the people on a percentage basis. If you had $100,000 house 6 years ago, it's now a $400,000 house. So it's gone up basically 4 times. If you had a $500,000 house, it might be $1 million house, but it's only doubled. On a percentage basis, the politicians and the powers that be are going to have to deal with the issue that when the new assessments come through, the lower income property, lower priced properties are going to be the ones with the highest increases on a percentage base, which is going to shift the burden of property taxes more so onto lower income properties, and by, just the mere fact of it, lower income people, and how they're going to deal with that, because that's going to be, aside from the 1.9%, all that stuff we talk about every year, that's going to be what I think is a very big issue. And there's going to be a lot of politicians who probably aren't thinking about it because they don't understand it.
Melinda, last word to you on this topic.
Oh, I don't really have the last word. Just said that, I mean, there's already talk about how to phase those increases in because of that exact problem.
Yeah, they always
Okay.
phase them in over 4 years.
In Jason Raynar's report that he gave last summer, he actually talked about the continual downward pressure on taxes in relation to inflation has eroded our ability to raise revenue through taxes in the future. Like, we haven't trained ourselves to be prepared for these kinds of shocks.
Should have done the Bitcoin idea. We would have made a fortune.
We'll never get over the Bitcoin thing. Okay, time to move on to our For Your Consideration segment. I'll go first. So this is a story that was really fascinating to me. It's totally nerdy, so I hope you'll all bear with me. You can find it on wired.com. I promise we'll post the link on social media this time, but it is about, it is a really fascinating article about citizenship database in Pakistan and the challenges that people have because of the structure of that database. And it's really interesting to me personally because it identifies the technical details behind the seemingly absurd bureaucratic problems. In this particular instance, the gentleman that they were writing the piece about could not get his citizenship papers because his parents were not married in their database, and only married parents can produce a citizen, according to the database that Pakistan uses. And it shows the ways that we build long-term systems and we try to build them in a way that is conformant to our social norms. And sometimes those social norms are fleeting. I really like it because it's as a practitioner in this area, I recognize that they were taking their time and explaining to the general reader exactly how this stuff works behind the scenes, even getting into the details of the data types that are used to identify gender and why that type of data has had to change over time. So really worth a read if you're interested in identity and databases and kind of the future of how databases become part of the way that we enforce and inform our social structures. Okay, and John is not back yet. He's indisposed for a moment. So Melinda, do you have a For Your Consideration item this week?
Sure, not a particularly interesting one like that. That was actually pretty fascinating, and I was recently talking about that with another municipality. Similar things about choosing their databases. So I'm actually going to change the one that I had proposed, and I'm going to talk about a different one. So I'm a bit of a municipal nerd. So the Institute for Municipal Finance and Governance published a paper today that perhaps Don might be interested in. And it was talking about what it would look like to have an equalization or transfer payment system provincially. So how would the province, the federal government issues equalization payments according to a formula to each province. And so this was talking about what it might look like if the provincial government took in the income tax revenue and then paid out on a formulaic basis payments to the municipalities. And they already do to a certain extent. The question that was interesting to me when I looked at it was, one of the factors they would have to figure out is the municipality using all of its fiscal capacity? So if one were to look at Windsor, for example, and say, are you using your tax powers to the fullest extent possible to raise revenue, and then everything above that that's unequal, we'll send you a transfer payment. So all those rich people in the GTA will transfer some of their income to you above your fiscal capacity. And I thought that was a very interesting question. Like, how you compare fiscal capacity between, say, Temiskaming Shores or Fort Francis or London or Windsor or Toronto to decide, how the transfer payments should flow from one municipality to the other? Interesting question.
It is
Well,
interesting.
I think more rich Toronto people should send us money. Something similar. Sorry, I know we're trying to wrap the show up. Something similar to that, going back to our tax discussion, something that never gets factored in, and I think it's a very important factor when you're talking about property taxes. A lot of times you'll see they compare a 2,000 square foot house in Toronto compared to a 2,000 square foot house in Windsor. Based off of size and everything, they basically pay the same taxes, and they say, well, we're not paying too much taxes. Something they never consider, which really is very important, is the ability to pay on that homeowner. If you have a 200,000 square foot house in Toronto, it's a $2 million house. The income required to finance that house and to maintain it on a monthly basis is going to be a lot more than Windsor. So when you're comparing set properties like that, and this goes back to your transfer payment thing, would probably work into this. It's ability to pay is probably the most important factor when you're deciding if your taxes are fair relative to the rest of the province, because I don't believe they ever take in municipal income levels. And we know we have a terrible income issues, with family incomes and individual incomes in the city relative to the rest of the province. For your consideration, just listen to Don. No, that was just more a comment. I didn't. If you want me to do 2 seconds, we were going to talk about that development. So I'll give you the lowdown on that development situation in Toronto, in Tecumseh or St. Clair Beach real quick. The developer wants to build, I think it was a 60-unit condominium building. It was approved. It has been put on hold by the municipality because of basically sewer capacity. Sewer capacity is generally relative to where in the city it's being built. You see a whole bunch of houses being built in one area, that obviously increases the use of the sewer. He has, got some remediation ideas of basically doing a giant holding tank in that. That is not just a Lakeshore problem. That is, we've had issues in Amherstburg. Some developments have been put on hold for the same reason. Unfortunately, it seems municipalities love development, but they don't love to plan for it, with what is needed in place before you can do that. So that is basically the situation out there. And Melinda brought up in the previous topic about, Doug brought up, I'm blaming everything on Melinda. Doug brought up, he'd be interested in seeing who donates to camp. Well, don't kid yourself. There's a million developers who donate lots of money, and it's not because they like to go to the cool parties. So Rocco Trulio, who out in Lakeshore, feels like he's being slighted a little bit because other projects have been approved after his was put on hold. As someone who's been in the real estate industry for a couple decades now plus, don't kid yourself. There's a lot of politics and favoritism played in development decisions made in any municipality, and don't think those political donations don't come with strings attached.
John Merrifield, everybody. Okay, John, why don't you wrap us up with for your consideration and then take us out?
Okay, I'll be really quick about this one. I came across a report from the group New American Leaders, and they were providing policy recommendations to help close the representation gap for underrepresented groups, as well as improve representation and policies overall. Now, they are aiming towards US state legislatures, and the conversation is about full-time legislatures versus part-time legislatures. And I guess the vast majority of state legislatures in the US are part-time. And, it made me think, because I was having a conversation last week about the role of part-time counselors and full-time counselors. So, it's not a direct applicable here, but I think some of the policy recommendations, it brings up the role and the question of what do we want our counselors to be, full-time or part-time? And if we do want them to be full-time, what does that come with? So their goals here are their recommendations to help close that gap for the underrepresented groups and to improve representation and policies. Up one was full-time legislatures. Second was to appoint independent compensation committees that would determine the rate of pay for the legislatures, not themselves. Third was full-time staff support, something that I've spoken with a few counselors about here locally. And I mean, they would just love to have, dedicated full-time staff available at their disposal, whether it be for constituency work or for research work or for, anything that may come up. They look to, I think, the mayor's office and go, man, wouldn't it be nice to be able to get something that, doesn't have to be exactly that, but something that looks to it. Fourth was childcare, which of course makes sense. And then fifth, what I thought really interesting, candidate recruitment and training. So the idea of getting into the community, trying to find people from the organization itself to tap members of the community and say, hey, you might be interested in doing this, and then to provide that training as well. I think there are 5 pretty sensible recommendations that could provide for a, not necessarily more accountable politicians, but a wider swath of them from, as people who aren't able to take part in this process for whatever reason, whether it be for that rate of pay, whether it be because of childcare. So something you should think about for your consideration. So that is that. And this has been our show. We are just over the 8 o'clock mark. So you'll be listening now, knowing where we are actually at in the recording process. Thank you for tuning in tonight. It is the 24th of November. Our regular panel tonight included myself, John Lidke, Doug Sartori, and Don Merrifield Jr. Our guest panelist and our guest tonight was Melinda Munro, local municipal consultant and integrity commissioner. And she was able to provide her insight into, a lot of really important matters. We always love having you on the show. And if we don't get a chance to have you on the show before the new year, I guess I'm going to start now by saying Happy New Year, because we're getting close to that point right now. So we are in BizX Magazine on all your favorite social media apps. Head over to patreon.com/Rose City Politics, if you will. And Rose City Politics has been able to broadcast live on tape thanks to the kind support of Liuna 625, Building Better Communities. We will be back next week.